affairs. Okay, so hi guys. Today I'm going to be doing a seminar on the introduction to state tools of foreign policy. So a little bit of background where a lot of this information came from and why specifically I chose to do this type of seminar. It came from the idea that international relations is a very, very complex topic that has a lot of breadth or depth, right? There's just a lot of things you could talk about. There are a lot of things going on in the world in all sorts of different disciplines. And to be able to try to keep up with the news and understand those specific individual interactions is very difficult. So instead of doing that, what I chose to do is try to classify a bunch of things under broad sets of ideas. And I hope that that could help you as well, because if you're able to do that and you have the theory behind what all possible actions a state could take, then you could probably just find an example to fit under that mold anyways. So basically, it's a theory approach first, and then you could find as many examples as you want to fit that theory versus looking at examples and trying to derive theory out of it. So that's kind of introduction to this. So this will basically set you up with the basic understanding of what a state kind of does, what are their incentives, how much room do they have to make decisions, and what are their tools in their box. And also, I'll be posting these slides that you could look at after. And also, I'll be posting a Google Doc that I made that has a lot of information that you could use in a round if you need to like reference it. That's a lot easier to access than a Google slide. So let's get into it. So before we talk about the tools that are available for a state, it's important to understand what are the incentives and capacity of a state to act, right? Because obviously we could all do different things, but it's important to understand when are we specifically going to go and do those things and what are the limitations to the things that we can do, right? So yes, like technically a country could go declare nuclear war, but is that likely? And like, what are the restrictions by which that is like either plausible or even possible, right? So that is kind of a very important conceptual understanding to debates in IR in general. And that you have to understand what are the state incentives and capacity. And then you could, again, after you understand the theory behind it, you could apply it to each country. And I'll show you what that looks like. So the basic state incentives are as follows. Firstly, there's incentive for self-preservation, right? So that looks like averting any harm, whether it be social, political, economic, that could diminish the current circumstances of a nation, right? And that's the primary incentive, obviously, because the United States wants to make sure the United States persists for whatever reasons, because of like, like nationalism, because you have like a lot of material gain from being in power. The individuals that comprise the state create kind of like this collective interest that makes them want to make sure that we preserve as a national identity so we don't have to be like under some other government, right? So it's kind of like if you look at nature and create an analogy, it's kind of like an animal's instinct to survive. The second one is self-propagation, and that's seeking opportunities to benefit the current circumstances of a nation, right? So you can see how both of these are remarkably similar. It's just the difference is that obviously a country wants to first prevent infliction of any harm before they try to get benefit, right? It's better to be a country that like is a stagnant line than one that goes down. You want to make sure that you don't like actually recede and lose anything. That looks way worse and that you are actually taking a harm from what you had before. So those are kind of like the basic state incentives. And when you're in debate round and you're talking about like a state, obviously they might have different incentives that are more unique to them, but in quite general, it's going to exist in that, right? So for example, if you're talking about a weaker state, the incentives might more lie in self-preservation. If you're talking about like the United States or China, you might be talking more about self-propagation. So now I want to talk about the capacity of a state to act, right? Because sure, we can all have the incentive to be millionaires, but what is actually considered realistic in the sphere of what's possible is what capacity is, right? It's like, what are the limitations for an actor to do something? So capacity to act and resist then is the second part of this. The capacity to act and resist depends on many material, social, and international factors. These are the three buckets that I put them in. So firstly, material circumstances, right? These are things like geography, population, economic development, and military size, right? These are very objective and real things that have real consequences on your capability as a state to do certain actions, right? It's very different for the United States, for example, that has a very large military population, land mass, resources, and they have a lot more ability to make certain decisions, then let's just say like Canada, right, that has a smaller economy, like literally 1/10 of the population, and a very, very small military size compared to that of the United States. The second thing is social circumstances, right? That looks like government integrity, national morale, ideology, and national interest, right? So obviously, you can't do whatever you want. Your own population has to stand by it. You have to get reelected and approved. So that creates limitations to what tools you could use at certain points against certain countries. Just in the same way that, like, obviously Canada can't nuke someone because we don't have a nuke. So you can't talk about like nuking other countries as Canada because we quite literally don't have any. So social circumstances are more like arbitrary and like have to do more with like the times, right? For example, like the national interests might be quite similar in Canada across certain decades, but the ideology right now of like what you say Trudeau might be different to Harper, who are both foreign prime ministers. And then lastly, foreign circumstances, right? These are kind of like the relative circumstances of other countries that bind you to certain decisions, right? For example, relative power to your neighbors, right? So like if I'm like Canada, my relative power to the United States is way weaker. So that definitely has an influence on the decisions I can make. Foreign reactions. I can't just do whatever I want because there's going to be foreign reactions. I can't just nuke China because China will send nukes back, right? So obviously considering foreign reactions is very important. Or like in a more relevant example, in Canada right now, or was before, we had two individuals in China being held captive because of like basically like this like foreign diplomacy issue, right? So I can't do whatever I want because if I do, then China might do something bad to those two individuals, i.e., like literally like perhaps like send them to death, and that is not a result that I necessarily want. And then lastly, external commitments and laws, right? So for example, international agreements. That definitely limits to what I could do. I can't just go into like, let's just say I can't as Germany go into France's territory and just say like, hey, this is now mine, right? There's very real like agreements on sovereignty and different rules. And as such, you can't just do like, whatever you want. So then these factors effectively decide the extent of what a state is actually capable of doing, right? And that has to do with material circumstances because obviously not every state is capable of doing everything just based on their nature, but secondly, realistically willing to do, right? And that's really, really important. And I think an issue a lot of debaters make, because just because a state has the like real capacity to do something does not mean that they have like the relative capacity to do something, right? Just because like China has, just because the United States has the capacity to overwhelm a lot of countries does not mean a lot of countries are just going to suddenly concede, right? So you have to consider other factors like social circumstances in those instances. So here is kind of putting this into action and kind of allowing you to understand what I mean. So when talking about state autonomy, let's apply the three factors of capacity to determine like what state autonomy might look like in principle, right? So firstly, material circumstances. Is the state capable of sufficiently funding themselves? How economically independent or indebted are they, right? That type of factor obviously affects your autonomy as a state to make decisions, because if you are not able to fund yourself, if you are a resource poor country and you are very dependent on deals from other countries, then obviously your ability to, for example, like let's just say act and retaliate against an aggressive country might be lower, especially if you're dependent on them, right? Secondly, social circumstances. Do they have order in their own country? Is there a narrative of resistance against other states, right? Does the ideology currently in power in the country go against that of the global order? Those are questions you'd ask under social circumstances if you're considering how much autonomy a country has to make decisions, right? So the note here is that narratives can be incredibly powerful, right? A state that is not necessarily materially rich could solely resist the influence of another state based on narrative. I point to examples of Vietnam, I point to North Korea right now, and I point to Afghanistan, right? Countries that are objectively weaker than the United States, yet still seem to have their own autonomy in resisting like what is going on, right? So in terms of like the international order and obligations, but still they have limitations in terms of foreign circumstances, right? Like, for example, they're not able to do whatever they want. They can't just walk into other countries because other countries own the territory. They still have some binding like limitations as to what their possible decision-making processes are. And lastly, foreign circumstances, like do you have other allies that could help you resist? Are they geographically near, right? So the implication of this is that material circumstances basically decide your raw power, and social and foreign circumstances decide relative power, which all combine to indicate how much decision making a state has in the global hierarchy, right? So if you put all this together, I think it's very clear. You're able to see A, who's in power at the top, B, who's in power at the bottom. So like basically like the system of power, right? And like you can apply all of this like theory to the United States and derive all like the reasoning from it, right? Like the United States has a lot of resources. They have like this American exceptionalist narrative. They like that means that they're not going to give up to anyone and want to like, you know, push their borders as far as possible to influence. They have a lot of allies and they have a huge sphere of influence, right? And you could apply this to other countries, like small countries, to see why specifically they're weaker and why that limits their autonomy to make decisions, right? So that allows you to understand what their global hierarchy, where their place is, and then how many decisions they could actually make. I think that this is all useful in the debate round because this allows you to have the most realistic arguments possible. Because once you start considering like whether the country you're talking about is actually capable of making the decisions you're talking about, then those are the times where it's going to be most plausible that it's actually going to happen the way it is, even if you don't know the actual political history of every single country and like the actual like in-depth analysis as to like why specifically their government might do this and that and blah, blah, blah. So this is like a useful application of that. So now let's talk about the state toolbox. So this is if the stuff before was a little bit confusing, don't worry. I feel like this is the bulk of what I'm supposed to be talking about today, which is the state toolbox, right? These are going to be basically every single option a state has to engage with another state in terms of foreign affairs. Notably, I'm talking about states engaging with other states. This is the main actor I'm talking about. I'm not talking about like, for example, like multinational corporations like I don't know, like Nestle, or like I'm not talking about like the United Nations like a lot here, but I'm mainly just talking about like, you know, how does China engage with the United States? How does the United States engage with the United Kingdom and Russia? Like these are what I'm talking about. So what are the buckets of decision making you can make? So the first thing to think about in terms of decisions is that you could only really make decisions within two spheres. They could either be cooperative or restrictive in nature, right? Given that international relations is about relationship, just like how I might be friends with Tyler, there's only really two things I could do, right? I could either try to become a better friend of Tyler, or I could say, hey, like Tyler, I don't really like you for whatever reason. Maybe it's because I want to screw you over and take over all your wealth. Maybe it's because I just don't like you because of what you stand for, but I might be like, you know what, I'm going to shun you. So that is an example of like the buckets that might exist, right? So for every decision we could possibly make, it's either going to be something that's going to be supportive and cooperative in nature to another country or restrictive. We're trying to put them down. So then, now we know that, what are the actual buckets that exist? So how do countries engage with each other? There's really three. Firstly, there's diplomatic tools, which is the conduct of international relations by negotiations and dialogue. I'll get more into each of these like now. Economic tools, the conduct of international relations by finance and economy. And lastly, military intelligence tools, the conduct of international relations by might and strategic superiority, right? So like this might be a common thing that you might hear of if you study political science, but like diplomacy, economics, and military. These are like the three main departments at which you are going to be engaging with other countries. So those are kind of pictures to represent that. So then let's start talking about what are the actual tools that exist. So I kind of tried to neatly summarize each of them in like their own little buckets. Notably, I could probably do a full-length seminar on like respectively each of these tools because they are all individually complex. But I'm just trying to give you a broad exposure of what tools countries have. So you kind of, when you go into rounds, you have an understanding of what they actually like, you know, what they actually can do. So let's start with economic tools. So the first thing there are is cooperative economic tools, right? So as I mentioned earlier, again, I'm splitting up things into economics, which is broadly like an approach to things in terms of foreign policy, and then how you're approaching it, right? Are you being nice or are you being mean, basically? That is my like buckets that I made. And then each of them, I kind of talked about more specific policies. So let's start with the resource distribution policy. So resource distribution policy is about like providing resources to another state, right? So it's basically being like, hey, like I have like money or this or that, and I'm going to try to give it to you or not give it to you depending on restrictive economic tools. So for cooperative, This looks like humanitarian aid, right? So for example, when we talk about countries like giving aid, let's just say like there's like an incident in like Haiti because of natural disaster, that looks like the United States being like, hey, like I'm gonna support you with money. I'm gonna bring in like international help, international organizations like the Red Cross and stuff like that. That looks like humanitarian aid. There's also developmental aid, right? This looks like, for example, going into a, let's just say you go to like any African country you could think of, or any like underdeveloped country, let's just say in the southern hemisphere of the world, and then you're just like, hey, like I will help you. Here's money. You can now like develop your economy or have build some infrastructure. And lastly, there's scientific and professional sharing treaties. So this looks like engaging with each other in terms of like not resources as in capital, but as in like, for example, like research. Like for example, if you have like a research agreement with the United Kingdom in order to like look into like, let's just say like you want to like create some new advancement in like technology, right? So those are all examples of resource distribution policies that you could enact as a country in order to cooperate or show goodwill to another country, right? Obviously, the dimensions of this are going to be very different once you apply it. Obviously, humanitarian aid could vary in size, in scope, in intent. Developmental aid could also vary in that if there's like expected is the United States expecting anything back there, or are they just giving a goodwill? Like these are all factors that are up to variable, but that's where you start considering the other factors I talked about of like, for example, that's where you think about like social circumstances, like what is the popular views of foreign affairs, what is a national position, so what are they likely to forge each of these tools, right? It's like these tools are broad, developmental is broad, but once you understand what are the circumstances the United States in terms of social circumstance and their general position on foreign affairs, then you'd be like, okay, this is exactly how they'd use the developmental aid, apart from them just using it in the first place. Then trade policies, you have promoting more free trade of capital and goods through trade liberalization, right? So this looks like trade treaties. Like for example, like North American Free Trade Agreement is an example. Well, that's not trade treaty, that's like a trade zone. But like, for example, you might have these different trade treaties among countries, like the UK negotiating with Canada in order to have free trade because they left the EU is a good example. So between countries, creation of free trade zones, and trade zones might look like the European Union, for example, right? So we have different extents of different cooperative unions. The European Union is probably like the largest economic union you could think, in the most like centralized one. And then also creating reductions of barriers, right? So ultimately, less tariffs. Tariffs are like basically putting on another like cost to imports. So for example, like like China is making like, let's just say beans, like a lot of beans. United States might be like, hey, like I want to prevent you from like screwing with my bean industry, so I'm gonna put tariffs on yours, which is like a tax. So like basically that means that China has the manufacturers in China have to pay more to get their goods into the United States, because instead of like, for example, only having the $4 cost, now they have the $4 cost plus $2 tax that the United States is putting on them in order to de-incentivize that, or to incentivize their own people from like, doing stuff. So basically, you're trying to reduce those barriers, try to make trade as easy as possible. The restrictive economic policies would be quite the opposite. But remember, there will be some unique policies that are only restrictive and not cooperative. So for resource distribution policy, it's withholding potential resources or reducing resource accessibility to another state, right? So the ultimate goal is, instead of trying to grant them resources, you're either trying to take it away or make it impossible for them to access stuff. So withholding humanitarian, obviously the opposite of giving it. Withholding developmental aid, right? This is what Trump, for example, did, I'm pretty sure, with Ukraine. And then economic sanctions, right? This is a unique one that's very restrictive and only applies to resource distribution that is restrictive. And economic sanctions are basically the way by which countries like restrict another country's ability to access certain things. There's a lot, again, I could do a whole thing on economic sanctions. There's a lot of them. You could sanction like certain individuals and prevent them from coming to your country. You can sanction whole industries. So for example, I may be like, I'm gonna make it impossible for the Chinese technology industry to access like outside goods, right? You could have sanctions. You could like freeze the assets of one individual. So it could be like, hey, like I really don't like Putin, so I'm gonna like freeze all his assets in the United States so he can't access them. So like let's just say he has $1 billion in a US bank. If I freeze his asset, which is a type of sanction, that makes it impossible for Putin to access it. Notably, this is what happened in Afghanistan recently, where the Taliban took over and the United States froze all of the Afghanistani like central bank's assets that exist in the United States. So it means the Taliban can't access it. That's an example of like basically an asset freeze. You could sanction an individual, you could sanction a company, you could sanction a whole industry. So there's varying extents of sanctions, obviously. And I could do a whole seminar on that. And so the key thing to know is that just whenever we use the term economic sanction, don't think about it as like a homogenous, like you are just making it impossible for the country to exist. It could be very laser focused. So that means that like it doesn't always mean that you ruin the whole country economy, although sometimes it does. And then trade policy, in terms of restrictive stuff, there's restricting the free movement of capital and goods through trade protectionism, right? So that looks like tariffs, which I just talked about as like a tax, or quota, which is like basically being like, you're only allowed to take in this much of this good. So instead of like a limitless flow of wheat, let's just say United States, or like I'm pretty sure like an example could be like timber from Canada, United States, instead of saying like, hey, like we'll accept as much timber as you want, you might be like, hey, we're only accepting 100 pieces of timber every single year. That's an example of a quota. And then lastly, like restrictions on investment. So making like impossible to like invest in other countries, foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investments like investment by other like corporations or private entities into like other countries, like basically private entities. So like making that harder or like restricting it. So being like, okay, you're not allowed to, corporations in Canada are not allowed to invest in corporations in North Korea. Like that's not allowed. Which I think is also part like economic sanction, but also like a restriction on investment. Military and intelligence tools. So we have cooperative military tools. So and we have restrictive. So militarization policy. Militarization is basically the idea of like actually building up your military and show military strength. So it's engaging in acts. Cooperative is like basically demilitarizing or to form stronger military cooperations. So it looks like joining or offering military alliances or security pacts, right? Like the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or NATO. That's a good example of a military alliance among a lot of Western states. Provision of military, or a good, better, even recent one, I forgot what it's called, but it's the one between the United Kingdom, I think it's the United Kingdom, Canada, United States, and Australia as like a way to counterbalance China. Then after you could provide foreign military aid and technical assistance or training, which is something the United States does a lot of. Like they try to militarize other countries, and that's a way, again, of goodwill. Like I'm like, hey, I will help you build a strong military. That country will probably be like, hey, I really like that, thank you. Intelligence policy, which is more of a new thing, to be quite honest, that we should consider in debates, but you should probably now. This looks like utilizing foreign intelligence collected for cooperative purposes. Notably, I'm not talking about whether countries are actually collecting or not, because they're going to do it anyways. They're going to have spies. They're going to do stuff. So the question is whether they're going to be doing it to you specifically a lot, or how are they going to use that intelligence that they get. So for example, Five Eyes is an example of a like intelligence organization that I forgot what countries to be. I don't know what countries that includes. I know it includes Canada. I know it includes the United States, UK, and I think New Zealand and Australia. I'm not sure, but it's basically like a cooperation of like a bunch of intelligence agencies. So again, cooperation. We like that. After that, limiting spying, right? So being like, hey, I'm not going to spy on you as much, although I don't know how often that happens. And then lastly, military engagement policy. I think that cooperative military policy is like engagement policy is very simple. I literally just think it's peace. It's like avoiding military engagement with other political communities, because I think like anything else is restrictive. I even think like peacekeeping operations, even if they have the full consent of like everyone else, is still restrictive, because if you go into another state and you have military presence, you are restricting to them in some capacity. You are doing some display of force. You are like antagonizing them in some way. So I don't think that there's such thing as like a opposite to military engagement policy. I only think it's peace. Restrictive ones, we have military policy, militarization policy, which is engaging in acts to either build up or display military strength. So military buildups, mobilization, troop movements, test weapon firing, territorial claims. This is really important, guys. This one happens a lot in rounds where you talk about, for example, China and I forget the name of like, but the sea near it. For example, that's where you talk about like territorial claims. North Korea is where you start talking about like test weapon firings. Recently, they had like a sub do a test weapon firing. Troop mobilization on the borders of, for example, like South Korea, or on the borders of like basically Russia on the Ukrainian border from NATO. Those are all example of militarization policies that are restrictive in nature. They're both restrictive and cooperative because you're working with some countries, but you are doing it against someone else. Intelligence policy looks like utilizing foreign intelligence collected for malicious or intrusive purposes. So, for example, influence operations, propaganda, fake news, increased spying, cyber attacks. These are all really relevant things happening now. That's an example of what Russia is doing a lot of. So that's like a restrictive military / intelligence tool. And then lastly, military engagement policy, right? This is like the obvious stuff. This is like engaging with other political communities or actors of interest. This looks like secret paramilitary operations, Navy SEALs, drone strikes, assassinations, armed interventions, blockades, war, peacekeeping. This is all of that nitty gritty, like man to man or like AI to AI nowadays engagement that happens between country. Direct engagement. So you could think of intelligence as less like indirect engagement, which is why we talk about cyber warfare. And then lastly, diplomatic tools, which would be quick. Cooperative diplomatic tools, we have institutional participation policy. So like a key terms that you should know for IR, and I'll flag them at the end, is like bilateral and multilateral engagement. Bilateral is between two countries, multilateral is between many countries, right? So multilateral participation policy or institutional, cooperative diplomatic tools look like prioritizing participation in different international organizations, right? It looks like membership in international and regional organizations. Like, for example, being a member of the United Nations, being a member of the European Union, joining negotiations, treaties, summits, right? If you guys know summits, it's like meetings of different state leaders to discuss something, and there's many of them happening. I'm pretty sure there's one happening soon. Exchanges, respect for international laws, also a big one, right? If you're not like respecting it, then you're kind of like sending a like restrictive diplomatic tool or saying like, hey, screw everyone else, like I'm doing whatever I want. Bilateral engagement policies between two countries. So that's focused on engaging with other states to ensure good ties and perceptions. That's like diplomatic recognition. So being like, oh, a good example of that is like in Israel, where like United States used their diplomatic recognition to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, even though a lot of other countries don't, given the conflict between Palestine and Israel, where they both claim that that's their capital, right? So that's an example of the power of diplomatic tools. If they're literally just saying that's their capital, they're just moving their embassy. They're not giving them more money. They're not going to war, but it still has a very powerful effect because remember, narratives in foreign affairs can be power. Identity is a very powerful tool. So there's also cultural and scientific exchanges, meetings, and soft power, right? Soft power being like the actual branding of your country. For example, like being like hard powers, like hey, we're going to use our military. We're actually going to use our economy. Like we're going to use very tangible and real things to screw you over or to make you do what we want. Soft power is like more about trying to convince people to do what you want, right? So being like basically cultural products and stuff like that, being like trying to convince people democracy is better. So it's like the citizens of the country believing that democracy is better. That has more to do with like your actual like power as a country in terms of like media and stuff like that. And then restrictive diplomatic tools, opposite, you're limiting participation in different international organizations. So for example, you're suspending your membership in IOs, international organizations with legal organizations. Brexit, that is a restrictive diplomatic tool where they suspended membership. United States pulling out of the Paris Agreement, that is a restrictive diplomatic tool. Withdrawing from negotiations and treaties, withdrawing from negotiations. North Korea does that all the time as a restrictive diplomatic tool. Withdraw from treaties, summit meetings. Putin just withdrew from like an energy meeting literally like this week. Ignoring international law. Those are examples of restrictive diplomatic tools. And then bilateral ones, it's like receding diplomatic recognition. So like, hey, I don't even think you're a state anymore. Expelling diplomats, which is something that happens very often where countries are like, oh, okay, I'm going to take away my diplomats because that means I don't want to work with you anymore. I'm pretty sure France did that recently in response to the countries creating an agreement without them. And then withdrawing from diplomatic exchanges. So, summary. those are just a couple of important concepts, but I think I explained them. Summary, these are basically everything a country could possibly do. I don't think I hit maybe all of them. This is most of everything. Anything else will be super niche, but these are broadly all the different actions a country takes. So now you have the theoretical understanding of how countries engage with each other and the theoretical understanding of what specific factors bind countries to make certain decisions, what makes them powerful, what makes them weak, and what are their incentives. So that's my lecture for today. I hope you guys learned a little bit about foreign affairs and the tools that countries use. And yeah, so I'm going to end my recording now.